4:15 in the morning. The Northern Arabian Sea. The USS Ronald Reagan was 500 miles off the coast of Iran when the first flash of light appeared on the long-range infrared sensors. The nuclear-powered aircraft carrier was operating at modified battle stations, but the crew was not prepared for what was descending from the upper atmosphere. This was not a slow-moving cruise missile or a low-flying drone that the screen of destroyers could easily pick off with their standard defenses. Exactly 3 minutes earlier, a mobile launcher hidden in the rugged mountains of southern Iran had ignited a Fateh 110 ballistic missile. The weapon had soared into the edge of space before tipping its nose downward, accelerating to 5 times the speed of sound. How a land-based missile had achieved such a precise track on a moving carrier remained a question for the intelligence officers who were now screaming into their headsets. The air over the flight deck thick with the heavy, sweet smell of JP-5 jet fuel and the sharp tang of salt spray. The sea was a dark, rolling expanse of obsidian, broken only by the white wake of the massive ship. Below the flight deck, thousands of sailors were beginning their morning routines, unaware that a 3,000-pound warhead was currently shrieking toward them at several kilometers per second. The Aegis combat system on the cruiser CG-67, Shiloh had attempted an intercept, launching 2 Standard Missile-3 interceptors into the black sky. One missed by 100 meters as the Iranian missile performed a terminal maneuver. The second exploded too late. Its shrapnel peppered the air, but failed to stop the kinetic energy of the incoming threat. The impact was not a single sound, but a sequence of structural failures that felt like the world was ending. The warhead punched through the flight deck aft of the island, slicing through layers of high-tensile steel as if they were wet paper. It continued its downward path, deep into the guts of the ship, before the proximity fuse finally triggered the high-explosive payload. The detonation occurred in the auxiliary machinery room, just above the waterline on the starboard side. The shockwave was so powerful it lifted the 97,000-ton vessel several inches out of the water. For the sailors in the berthing areas nearby, the world became a blur of orange fire and the deafening roar of tearing metal. Light bulbs shattered, bulkheads buckled, and the very floor beneath, their feet humped upward like a living thing. Inside the bridge, Captain Robert Miller was thrown against the navigation console. His ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the frantic reports coming over the internal comms. He looked at the inclinometer on the bulkhead. The needle was moving. It passed 3 degrees, then 5. It stopped at 7 degrees to starboard, reporting flooding in engineering compartments 4 and 5. A voice crackled through the chaos. The hull is breached below the waterline. We are taking water fast. The pumps cannot keep up with a hole this size. The carrier was now leaning, a steel mountain tilting into the dark water of the Arabian Sea. On the crossed flight deck, the FA-18 Super Hornets, each weighing 30,000 pounds, strained against their heavy tie-down chains. The metal links groaned and popped with the tension of the 7-degree list. If the list increased to 10 degrees, the chains would fail, and tens of millions of dollars of aircraft would begin sliding into the sea, crushing anything in their path. At coordinates 23 degrees, 12 minutes north, longitude 61 degrees, 45 minutes east, the pride of the United States Pacific Fleet was wounded and vulnerable. The smell of burning electrical insulation and hydraulic fluid began to drift through the ventilation system, a sickening scent that every sailor recognized as the smell of a ship fighting for its life. The emergency lighting flickered on, casting a sickly red glow over the smoke-filled corridors. Damage control teams, dressed in their heavy fire-retardant suits, began to scramble toward the sound of rushing water. They carried heavy wooden shores and steel patches, moving against the slant of the deck, their boots slipping on the spilled oil and seawater that was already beginning to pool in the lower levels. The USS Ronald Reagan was no longer an instrument of power projection. It was a 300-meter-long emergency ward, and the clock was ticking. Every gallon of water that poured through the jagged hole in the hull brought the ship closer to a catastrophic roll. The ocean was claiming the carrier, and the battle to save her had only just begun. 7 degrees. The number hung in the air of the damage control central compartment like a death sentence. The inclinometer on the bulkhead of the USS Ronald Reagan was no longer swinging with the natural roll of the sea. It was pinned, a static indicator of the thousands of tons of seawater now surging into the ship's guts. At 7 degrees to starboard, the massive aircraft carrier was reaching a critical threshold. If the list increased to 10 degrees, the internal fuel lines for the aircraft would begin to fail, and the primary firefighting pumps would lose suction. The ship would not just be sinking, it would be defenseless. Damage Control Central was a hive of controlled, professional intensity. The Damage Control Assistant, a commander with 20 years of service, stood over the digital status board, his eyes tracking the red sectors flashing across the ship's internal schematic. The environment here was thick with the smell of ozone from shorted electrical panels and the sharp, metallic scent of high-pressure steam that had been vented to prevent a secondary explosion. Every few seconds, the deck shuddered as the carrier's 4 massive propellers struggled to maintain a speed of 10 knots against the drag of the intake. Report from Repair Locker 5. A technician shouted over the din of alarms. The primary fire main in Section 4 is severed. They are losing pressure in the hangar deck sprinklers. We have a Class Bravo fire in the auxiliary machinery room that is out of control. A Class Bravo fire meant burning fuel thousands of gallons of JP5 aviation kerosene that had leaked from a ruptured line directly above the impact zone. Below the flight deck, the temperature was soaring toward 1,000 degrees. The steel bulkheads were beginning to glow a dull, angry red, and the paint was blistering off the walls in long, scorched strips. The commander did not hesitate. Initiate counterflooding in portside tanks 1 through 4. Transfer 600 tons of fuel from the starboard service tanks to the port side. We need to get this ship back to 5 degrees before we lose the flight deck. Counterflooding was a desperate, calculated gamble. To level the ship, they had to intentionally invite more water into the undamaged side of the vessel, increasing the overall weight and decreasing the ship's freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the deck. It was a move that traded buoyancy for stability. At coordinates 23 degrees 12 minutes north, 61 degrees 45 minutes east, the ocean was a predatory force. The seawater rushing into the hull was under immense pressure, a cold, black torrent that crushed everything in its path. In the flooded compartments, the sound was a deafening roar, like a jet engine caught in a tunnel. Damage control teams, wearing their oxygen-breathing apparatuses, worked in chest-deep water that was slick with oil and debris. They were moving heavy timber shores, thick beams of Douglas fir into place to reinforce the bulkheads that were bowing under the weight of the sea. The physical strain was immense. Each sailor was carrying 60 pounds of gear while moving against a deck that was slanted like a steep hill. The air was a thick fog of white steam and black smoke, illuminated only by the rhythmic, pulsing red of the emergency strobes. They could hear the ship groaning, the sound of massive steel girders twisting and screaming as the structural integrity of the Reagan was tested to its absolute limit. On the bridge, Captain Miller watched the inclinometer. For 5 agonizing minutes, the needle did not move. Grinding vibration that vibrated through the soles of his boots, the needle began to creep back toward the center. 7 degrees became 6.5, then 6. The counterflooding was working. We're holding at 5.8 degrees, Skipper, the navigator reported. But we're sitting 3 feet lower in the water. Our speed is dropping. We're down to 8 knots. The Ronald Reagan was leveling out, but she was becoming a heavier, slower target. Outside, the rest of the carrier strike group was tightening the circle. The destroyer DDG-113 John Finn and the cruiser CG-67 Shiloh were cutting through the swells at 30 knots, their ANSPY-6 radars searching the horizon for the next threat. They knew that the Iranians would not stop at one hit. A crippled carrier was an opportunity that a regional adversary could not ignore. The smell of the sea, once a constant and familiar companion, now felt like an invader. Every wave that slapped against the hull was a reminder of the thousands of tons of pressure trying to find another weak point in the armor. The crew of the Reagan had stopped the initial roll, but the fire was still raging, and the enemy was still out there, somewhere in the dark, preparing the next salvo. 4:45 in the morning. The Northern Arabian Sea. The USS Ronald Reagan was a wounded giant, trailing a thick plume of black smoke that smeared the pre-dawn horizon. While the damage control teams were successfully fighting the list, the ship was now a beacon for every infrared sensor within 200 miles. The Iranians had not waited for the smoke to clear. At a coastal facility near Jask, the second phase of the operation was already in motion. 32 drones, a mixture of Shahed 136 loitering munitions, and larger Mohajer 6 surveillance platforms were launched in a coordinated swarm. They flew low, barely 10 meters above the Whitecaps, their lawnmower-like engines creating a buzzing drone that was lost in the roar of the sea. Behind them, 4 truck-mounted launchers fired K-102 NOR anti-ship cruise missiles. These weapons accelerated to high subsonic speeds, their active radar seekers scanning the empty ocean for the massive radar cross-section of a Nimitz-class carrier. In the Combat Direction Center of the USS Ronald Reagan, the tactical action officer stood behind the air defense console. The room was dark, illuminated only by the blue and green glow of the tactical displays. The air was pressurized and filtered, but a faint, acrid scent of electrical fire still managed to seep through the vents. Vampire, vampire, vampire. The internal comms channel erupted. Multiple inbound cruise missiles, bearing 045, range 40 miles. Swarm of low-slow contacts trailing the primary threats. The carrier was still listing 5.8 degrees to starboard, which meant the Mark 41 vertical launch systems on the starboard side were tilted, potentially affecting the launch geometry of the defensive missiles. On the port side, the cruiser CG-67 Shiloh and the destroyer DDG-113 John Finn surged ahead to intercept. Shiloh is engaging with evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, the warfare commander reported. John Finn is engaging with the 5-inch gun and Standard Missile 2. The night sky was suddenly torn apart by streaks of white and orange light. From the decks of the escort ships, the RIM 162 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles shrieked upward, their solid rocket motors illuminating the ocean for miles. 2 of the Iranian cruise missiles were intercepted 20 miles out, blooming into brief, violent spheres of fire that rained debris into the dark water. But the swarm was too large for the escorts to catch everything. 12 drones and 2 cruise missiles slipped through the outer defensive ring. The USS Ronald Reagan was forced to rely on its own point defense systems. Because of the ship's list, the calibration of the ANSPY-6 radar was slightly off, requiring the systems to operate in manual override. The close-in weapon system, the phalanx on the starboard sponson, began to rotate, its 6-barrel 20mm Gatling gun pointing toward the approaching swarm. The sound was a continuous, vibrating roar, like a giant sheet of canvas being ripped in half. The phalanx fired at a rate of 4,500 rounds per minute, sending a wall of tungsten alloy tracers into the sky. The first Shahed drone was shredded 300 meters from the hull, its fuel tank exploding in a brilliant orange flash that reflected off the carrier's steel skin. Bridge, TAO. We have 1 cruise missile remaining. On a terminal high dive profile, the officer shouted, "Brace for impact, starboard side." The rolling airframe missile launcher on the aft port sponson fired. 2 missiles spiraled out, their heat-seeking heads locking onto the friction heat of the cruise missile's nose cone. 1 missed, but the second clipped the missile's tailfin. The K-102 NOR veered sharply, losing its aerodynamic stability. It did not hit the hull, but it detonated 50 meters off the starboard quarter. The resulting geyser of seawater rose 80 feet into the air, drenching the flight deck and the sailors working the fire hoses. The shockwave rattled the ship, knocking 3 more Super Hornets slightly out of their chocks. But the hull remained uncompromised by this second strike. The sky was beginning to turn a bruised purple as the sun approached the horizon. The surface of the sea was littered with the burning remains of the Iranian drones, small flickering fires that looked like candles on a black cloth. The strike group had held the line, but the cost was visible in the mounting fatigue of the crew. and the dwindling magazines of the defensive missiles. The air smelled of cordite, ozone, and the heavy salt of the Arabian Sea. The carrier was still alive, but it was a ship under siege. For every missile the United States Navy fired, the Iranians had 10 more on the shore. The strategic objective was clear. The Reagan had to move out of the range of the coastal batteries, or it would eventually be overwhelmed by the sheer math of the engagement. 5:15 in the morning. The Northern Arabian Sea. The Aegis screen was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a wall of fire and silicon standing between the wounded carrier and total destruction. To the west of the USS Ronald Reagan, the cruiser CG-67 Shiloh and the destroyer DDG-113 John Finn were operating at flank speed, their gas turbine engines screaming as they churned the dark water into a frothing white wake. The two ships were the primary nodes of a complex, automated network known as the Cooperative Engagement Capability, which allowed them to share a single, unified picture of the airspace. The environment around the escort ships was defined by a brutal, mechanical efficiency. On the bridge of the John Finn, the air was cold, kept at 18 degrees to protect the sensitive electronics of the AN/SPY-6 radar system. Outside, the pre-dawn sky was a hazy gray, smelling strongly of burnt solid rocket propellant and the sulfurous exhaust of the ship's own engines. The vibration of the hull was constant, a high-frequency shudder that rattled the teeth of every sailor on watch. Multiple tracks detected. Bearing 350, the Air Warfare Coordinator reported from the Combat Direction Center. They are coming off the Iranian coast in waves. High speed, low altitude. These are not drones. These are supersonic anti-ship missiles. At coordinates 23 degrees 15 minutes north, longitude 61 degrees 40 minutes east, the tactical situation was deteriorating. The Iranians had launched a third salvo, this time utilizing the supersonic YJ-12 anti-ship missile. These weapons were designed to fly at 3 times the speed of sound, leaving the defenders only seconds to react once they crossed the horizon. The Shiloh took the lead. From its forward Mark 41 vertical launch system, a sequence of 4 Standard Missile-6 interceptors erupted. Each launch was a violent event, a pillar of white-hot flame that momentarily bleached the gray sky into a blinding white. The heat was so intense it bubbled the non-skid coating on the deck nearby. The missiles shrieked upward, their solid-state seekers locking onto the tent, incoming threats while they were still 40 miles out. Track 1 neutralized. Track 2 neutralized. The technician called out, his voice flat and professional, despite the adrenaline. Tracks 3 and 4 are performing high-G maneuvers. They are diving. The John Finn stepped in to close the gap. The destroyer's 5-inch Mark 45 gun began to bark, firing high-explosive, electronically fused rounds at a rate of 20 per minute. Each shot sent a physical shockwave through the ship's superstructure, a rhythmic thump-thump-thump that could be felt in the soles of the crew's boots. The sky was filled with black puffs of smoke where the 5-inch shells detonated, creating a curtain of shrapnel intended to shred the delicate guidance fins of the supersonic missiles. Between the two escorts, the Aegis wall was holding. The Standard Missile-6s were hitting their targets with kinetic force, turning millions of dollars of Iranian technology into expanding clouds of aluminum and burning fuel. The debris hit the ocean with such force that it created secondary splashes visible on the surface search radars. However, the strain on the Aegis ships was becoming physical. The Mark 41 launch cells were beginning to run empty. On the Shiloh, 40% of the long-range interceptor magazine had been expended in less than an hour. The logistics of the carrier strike group were now a primary concern. There was no way to reload these vertical launch cells at sea. Once the missiles were gone, the wall would crumble. Inside the Ronald Reagan, the crew could hear the distant, muffled thud of the escort's guns. It was a comforting sound, a reminder that they were not alone in the dark. But the smoke from the fires on the hangar deck was still thick, and the list remained at 5.8 degrees. The carrier was still a stationary target in a dynamic battle space. The pre-dawn light finally broke across the horizon, revealing the true scale of the engagement. The sea was no longer black, but a deep, bruised blue, littered with the wreckage of dozens of drones and missiles. The Shiloh and the John Finn remained in their stations, their radar faces glowing with the energy of 1,000 microwave pulses, searching the Iranian coast for the next flash of light. They were the shield, but the shield was beginning to show the cracks of exhaustion. 5:45 in the morning. The hangar deck of the USS Ronald Reagan, the space that usually housed the pride of the United States Navy's air power, was now a cavern of black smoke and roaring orange flame. The ballistic missile had punched through the flight deck and detonated 2 levels below. But the secondary effect was arguably more dangerous: the rupture of the primary JP-5 aviation fuel lines. Thousands of gallons of high-pressure kerosene were spraying into the air, igniting instantly into a massive chemical fire that threatened to consume the heart of the ship. The environment was a nightmare of heat and noise. The temperature near the center of the blaze was estimated at over 1,200 degrees, enough to cause the heavy steel beams of the overhead to soften and sag. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of burning rubber and chemical propellant, while the sound was a continuous, low-frequency roar that drowned out all but the most urgent shouts. "Repair Locker 17. Advance your line," the hangar deck officer shouted through his heavy-duty respirator. "We need a wall of foam between the fire and those ordnance elevators." 400 damage control sailors, split into 25 teams, were currently engaged in the largest firefighting effort on a United States carrier since the late 1960s. They were using the P-25 shipboard fire trucks, each capable of pumping 750 gallons of aqueous film-forming foam per minute. The white, soapy substance flowed across the deck in a thick carpet, struggling to smother the flames that were dancing on top of the spilled fuel. The physical toll on the sailors was immense. Wrapped in their heavy, multi-layered firefighting ensembles and carrying 60-pound oxygen tanks, the men and women were rotating every 15 minutes to prevent heat stroke. Their visors were constantly fogging, and the deck, still listing at 5.8 degrees, was as slippery as an ice rink covered in oil and foam. To the port side of the hangar, 3 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were being manually pushed away from the heat by teams of 50 sailors each. The composite rotors and fuel-filled airframes were essentially massive tinderboxes. If the fire reached the aircraft or the nearby Mark 54 torpedoes staged for the morning patrol, the resulting series of sympathetic detonations would likely break the ship in half. Despite the chaos below, the command to retaliate was issued from the bridge. The United States would not remain on the defensive while its sovereign territory was burning. On the windward side of the flight deck, 2 FA-18 Bravo Super Hornets were hooked into the catapults, their engines screaming against the holdback bars as they prepared to launch into the pre-dawn light. The trigger was squeezed in the cockpit of the lead fighter. The AGM-158 JASSM cruise missile shrieked off the underwing pylon, a white column of fire punching backward through the humid sea air. The heat blast washed across the faces of the catapult crew standing nearest in their protective gear. The missile's small turbojet engine ignited 3 seconds later, and the weapon banked hard toward the Iranian coastline, its internal GPS slaved to the coordinates of the ballistic missile battery near Jask. 60 miles away, the stealthy cruise missile found its mark. The 1,000-pound warhead punched straight through the reinforced concrete roof of the primary command and control bunker, detonating deep inside the underground facility. The explosion was so powerful that the ground above the bunker humped upward before collapsing into a crater 50 meters wide. A massive fireball erupted from the entrance tunnels, sending a geyser of pulverized rock and black smoke 300 feet into the air. The Iranian defenders reacted in a blind panic. Personnel, who had been celebrating the successful strike on the carrier, were suddenly thrown off their feet by the shockwave, their eardrums cracked by the immense pressure. Men scrambled for the exits as the secondary fires from stored missile propellant began to cook off, turning the subterranean complex into a furnace. The surviving anti-air batteries began firing wildly into the empty sky, their radar systems blinded by the electronic interference from the EA-18 Gulf Growlers circling offshore. Black smoke rose from the wreckage of the Iranian base, a dark scar against the rising sun. The facility was silent now, the voices of its operators replaced by the crackle of burning electronics and the hiss of escaping steam. The first blow of the American counterstrike had landed with surgical precision, but the war was far from over. Back on the Reagan, the fire in Bay 2 was finally being pushed back. The list had stabilized at 5.5 degrees. As the engineering teams continued their struggle, the ship was wounded and her crew was exhausted, but the American flag was still flying over the most dangerous piece of territory in the Arabian Sea. 6:15 in the morning. The Northern Arabian Sea. The flight deck of the USS Ronald Reagan was a theater of desperate, high-stakes physics. The carrier was still maintaining a list of 5.5 degrees to starboard, which meant every movement of the aircraft and personnel was a struggle against gravity. To the pilots of Strike Fighter Squadron 102, known as the Diamondbacks, the slanted deck looked less like a runway, and more like a sliding board aimed directly into the churning gray water of the Arabian Sea. The environment was a sensory assault. The rising sun was a blood-red sliver on the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the non-skid surface. The air was a thick, swirling soup of salt spray. The high-pitched scream of twin F414 engines, and the acrid, heavy stench of burnt JP5 fuel drifting up from the still smoldering hangar deck. Despite the smoke, the deck crews moved with the mechanical precision of a Swiss watch, their colored jerseys, yellow, green, and red, standing out against the gray steel. Catapult 1 is green. Catapult 2 is green, the shooter signaled, his body braced against the slant of the deck. 14 FA-18 Super Hornets were being readied for the largest retaliatory strike in the history of the Fifth Fleet. Each aircraft was heavily laden, carrying a lethal assortment of AGM-88 HARM missiles for radar suppression and 1,000-pound joint direct attack munitions. Because of the list, the steam pressure in the catapults had to be precisely calibrated to compensate for the uneven friction on the launch shuttles. One mistake would send a $70 million fighter and its pilot straight into the sea. The lead Super Hornet, piloted by the squadron commander, taxied into the shuttle. The aircraft strained against the holdback bar, the afterburners illuminating the deck with two 10-meter plumes of blue and orange fire. The heat was so intense, it caused the air to shimmer and dance. With a violent, bone-jarring crack, the catapult fired. The fighter was flung forward, accelerating from 0 to 160 knots in less than 3 seconds, clearing the bow and climbing steeply into the morning haze. 30 minutes later, the strike package crossed the Iranian coastline near the port of Chabahar. The EA-18 Gulf Growlers had already filled the airwaves with a wall of electronic noise, blinding the local HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries. The American pilots could see the smoke from their earlier cruise missile strikes rising like black pillars in the distance. The trigger was squeezed in the cockpit of the lead Super Hornet. The AGM-154 joint standoff weapon shrieked off the underwing pylon, its wings deploying with a mechanical snap as it began its silent, GPS-guided glide toward a cluster of mobile ballistic missile launchers hidden in a dry riverbed. The rocket motor ignited for a terminal burst of speed, a white column of fire punching through the humid coastal air. The heat blast from the launch washed across the wing of the following aircraft, momentarily obscuring the pilot's vision with a cloud of chemical white smoke. The warhead punched straight through the armored roof of a mobile TEL, a transporter erector launcher, that was in the process of reloading. The 500-pound shaped charge detonated the half-fueled ballistic missile inside the vehicle instantly. The result was a catastrophic secondary explosion that lifted the 40-ton truck 10 meters into the air before it disintegrated into thousands of jagged steel fragments. A fireball 300 meters wide erupted, the heat so intense it melted the sand in the riverbed into black glass. The shockwave flattened every structure within a 200-meter radius, sending a plume of white and orange flame screaming into the sky. The Iranian defenders reacted in a state of total structural collapse. The crews of the nearby anti-aircraft guns abandoned their positions, running for the cover of the rocky hills as the heat from the burning launchers reached several thousand degrees. One surface-to-air missile battery attempted to fire a manual intercept, but the missile spiraled wildly out of control, its guidance system fried by the Growler's jamming before slamming into an empty hillside. The defensive formation broke apart as vehicles attempted to flee the kill zone, only to be picked off one by the circling Hornets. Black smoke rose from the riverbed, a funeral pyre for the hardware that had dared to strike the Reagan. The silence that followed the last explosion was absolute, broken only by the distant, receding whine of the American jet engines. The launch site was a graveyard of scorched earth and twisted metal, the remaining missile fuel hissing as it leaked into the hot sand. Back on the Reagan, the first wave of returning fighters was already entering the landing pattern. The ship was still tilted, the recovery of aircraft on a listing deck being one of the most dangerous maneuvers a pilot could attempt. But as the first Super Hornet caught the 3-wire and slammed into the deck, a cheer went up from the exhausted damage control teams. The Giant was wounded, but she was still biting back. 6:45 in the morning. The water's 10 miles off the starboard quarter of the USS Ronald Reagan. Two MH-60 Sierra Seahawk helicopters, call signs Raven 1 and Raven 2, were skimming the wave tops at 140 knots. The carrier was still fighting its internal fires and maintaining its precarious list, making it a massive, slow-moving target for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Mosquito fleet. Radar on the cruiser CG-67 Shiloh had just picked up 12 high-speed surface contacts emerging from the morning haze, moving at 45 knots on a direct interception course with the carrier's stern. The environment in the cockpit of Raven 1 was a cramped, high-vibration space filled with the mechanical whine of the twin T-7-100 engines and the smell of salt-heavy air and hot hydraulic fluid. Below them, the Arabian Sea was a choppy expanse of slate-gray water, the crests of the 2-meter swells catching the first bright rays of the climbing sun. The tactical situation was critical. If these fast attack craft reached the carrier, they could deploy torpedoes or suicide drones against the Reagan's vulnerable steering gear. Raven 1. You are weapons-free. The controller on the Shiloh crackled over the secure net. Engage and neutralize the lead elements of the surface group. The pilot of Raven 1 adjusted his grip on the cyclic, slaving the nose-mounted infrared sensor to the lead Iranian Boghammer patrol boat. On the multifunction display, the boat appeared as a bright white heat signature against the cold water. The helicopter banked hard to the left, positioning itself for a side-on engagement to maximize the effectiveness of its door-mounted weapons. The trigger was squeezed on the cyclic. The AGM-114 Hellfire missile shrieked off the starboard rail, a white column of fire punching backward through the humid sea air. The physical shock of the launch caused the 7-ton helicopter to shudder momentarily. The missile's rocket motor left a jagged trail of gray smoke. As it accelerated toward the target, the laser seeker locked onto the center of the boat's bridge. The warhead punched straight through the fiberglass hull of the lead boat, detonating the stored fuel and ammunition inside the cramped cabin. The impact was catastrophic. The fiberglass structure did not just break, it shattered into thousands of jagged fragments that were sent flying in a 360-degree radius. The hull split along the waterline, and the 6-ton vessel was lifted 2 meters out of the water by the force of the internal explosion before falling back and disappearing under a wall of white spray and black smoke. The remaining Iranian boats reacted in a state of immediate, violent panic. The formation, which had been a disciplined wedge, broke apart as the pilots kicked their rudders hard over to avoid the falling debris of their leader. They began to weave in erratic, high-G zigzags, their wakes crossing and churning the sea into a white froth. On the deck of the nearest boat, a gunner hammered away. At a DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine gun, his tracers arching wildly into the sky as he struggled to track the low-flying helicopter through the spray. Raven 2 dived into the fray, its door gunner opening fire with an M240 machine gun. The sound was a rhythmic, bone-deep thud, thud, thud that vibrated through the airframe. The brass casings poured out of the chute in a golden stream, falling into the sea below. The tracers walked across the water, kicking up small geysers of spray before finding the engine housing of a second boat. The metal shattered, and the vessel drifted to a halt, black oil spreading across the blue water like a spreading ink blot. A greasy smear of black smoke rose from the center of the engagement zone, marking the spot where the lead boat had been pulverized. The Iranian radio net, which had been filled with aggressive chatter only minutes before, went into a dead silence for 5 seconds, before erupting in a chorus of screaming voices and frantic orders to retreat. The surviving 10 boats turned back toward the coast, their engines screaming at maximum RPM as they fled the reach of the Seahawks. Back on the Reagan, the air boss watched the engagement on the large screen display in primary flight control. The immediate threat to the carrier's stern had been neutralized, but the cost of the morning was mounting. The carrier had now expended over 20 Hellfire missiles and thousands of rounds of small arms ammunition just to keep the perimeter clear. The smell of the sea was now tainted by the heavy, burnt toast scent of high explosives and the chemical bite of burning fiberglass. At coordinates 23 degrees, 20 minutes north, longitude 61 degrees, 30 minutes east, the United States Navy had held the line once again, but the carrier was still listing 5.5 degrees, and the long trek to a safe harbor was still hundreds of miles away through a gauntlet of hostile fire. 7 in the morning, deep within the hull of the USS Ronald Reagan, 4 levels below the waterline. The auxiliary machinery room was a cathedral of wet steel and absolute shadow, illuminated only by the frantic, narrow beams of waterproof LED flashlights. The air here was a choking mist of atomized seawater, hydraulic fluid, and the heavy, sweet scent of diesel. The carrier was still maintaining a list of 5.5 degrees to starboard, which meant the deck beneath the feet of the damage control teams was a slick, slanted precipice. Watch your step. The deck is coated in LO-14 lube oil, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins shouted, her voice echoing off the buckled bulkheads. Jenkins was the ship's senior damage control officer. She was currently leading a team of 12 hull technicians into the hot zone, the area directly adjacent to the primary missile breach. At coordinates 23 degrees, 22 minutes north, longitude 61 degrees, 28 minutes east, the Atlantic-sized pressure of the Arabian Sea was trying to tear the ship apart from the inside out. The physical environment was terrifying. The sound was a continuous, low-frequency groan of stressed metal, punctuated by the rhythmic, hammer-like thud of the sea slamming against the hull. In the center of the compartment, a jagged tear in the steel plate, 6 meters long and 2 meters wide, was partially covered by a temporary patch that was failing. Seawater was spraying through the gaps with the force of a fire hose, the pressure so high it could cut through a human limb like a saw. "We need the heavy shoring now," Jenkins commanded, gesturing toward a stack of 6x6 Douglas fir timbers. The team moved with the practiced synchronization of a professional sports team. 2 sailors, chest deep in oily, frigid water, wrestled a massive steel Jubilee patch into position over a ruptured cooling pipe. The metal was jagged and sharp. Even through their heavy gloves, the sailors could feel the vibration of the thousands of gallons of water rushing past them. The temperature of the water was a staggering 15 degrees, cold enough to induce hypoxia in minutes, yet the heat from the nearby smoldering electrical fires kept the air in the upper part of the room at a sweltering 40 degrees. The heroics here were measured in inches. Every timber that was wedged into place, every screwjack that was tightened against the overhead was a victory for the structural integrity of the ship. They were using K-type shoring, a complex arrangement of wooden beams designed to transfer the immense pressure of the ocean onto the ship's stronger internal frames. The sound of the wood groaning under the weight of the sea was like a series of gunshots echoing through the dark compartment. "Adductor pumps are at maximum capacity," a technician reported over the sound of the rushing water. "We've stabilized the level in compartment 4, but the seals on the shaft alley are starting to weep." Despite the exhaustion, there was no panic. This was the professional application of maritime engineering under fire. The damage control teams had been awake for 24 hours, their hands raw and bleeding, their eyes stung. by the salt and oil. Yet, they continued to work the problem, one weld and one brace at a time. They were the silent heart of the carrier, the people who kept the flight deck level so the pilots could bring the war to the enemy. By 7:30, the primary breach had been reinforced. The massive wooden beams were bowed under the weight of the Arabian Sea, but they were holding. The spray had been reduced to a heavy drip, and the primary pumps were finally beginning to gain ground against the flood. The list, which had peaked at 7 degrees, was now a manageable 5.2 degrees. The smell of the room had changed. The sharp bite of the seawater was still there, but it was now joined by the smell of wet wood and the iron scent of fresh welds. The team stood for a moment in the knee-deep water, their flashlight beams crossing. In the dark, they were covered in grease, shivering from the cold, and deafened by the noise, but they had saved the ship. The Reagan was still deep in the water, her speed restricted to 10 knots to avoid putting too much pressure on the temporary patches. But for the first time since the missile strike, the ship felt stable. The engineering department had won their battle in the dark, and because of them, the giant was still standing. 8 in the morning, the Northern Arabian Sea. The EA-18 Gulf Growlers of Electronic Attack Squadron 141 were circling at 30,000 feet, 30 miles off the Iranian coast. These specialized aircraft were the invisible shield of the carrier strike group, and right now, they were the only thing preventing a second ballistic missile from finding the wounded USS Ronald Reagan. Today was not a day for kinetic bombs. It was a day for the silent, overwhelming power of digital suppression. The environment inside the cockpit of the lead Growler was a cramped, high-tech cocoon. The air was pressurized and cool, smelling faintly of recirculated oxygen and the metallic tang of the pilot's own sweat. Outside, the sky was a pale, washed-out blue. But on the tactical displays, the world was a chaotic web of electromagnetic signatures. The electronic growl of the aircraft was a constant, high-pitched whine in the crew's headsets, a digital signature of the ANALQ-99 jamming pods, working at maximum capacity. Multiple emitters active at Bandar Abbas, the electronic warfare officer reported, his fingers dancing over the touchscreens. I have 2 HQ-9 search radars and 1 S-300 acquisition radar attempting to hand off a track to a coastal battery. The Growler responded instantly. At coordinates 23 degrees 30 minutes north, longitude 61 degrees 10 minutes east, the aircraft tilted its wings, directing its high-gain jamming antennas toward the shore. The jamming pods erupted with thousands of watts of targeted radio frequency energy, a digital noise designed to overwhelm the Iranian receivers. On the Iranian radar screens 60 miles away, the clear track of the carrier strike group suddenly dissolved into a flickering wall of static, often referred to by operators as electronic snow. The tactics were precise and ruthless. This was the suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD. For every frequency the Iranians attempted to hop to, the Growler's computers identified and smothered it in less than a millisecond. The Iranian operators were effectively blinded, unable to distinguish between the actual ships and the hundreds of ghost targets the Growlers were projecting into their sensor net. They're trying to use passive infrared tracking, the pilot noted, watching a secondary sensor feed, adjusting output to mask our thermal signatures, launching 2 AGM-88 HARM missiles to discourage their persistence. The trigger was squeezed. 2 high-speed anti-radiation missiles shrieked off the underwing stations. These weapons did not need a GPS coordinate. They ate radar beams, following the Iranian signals directly back to their source. The missiles accelerated to Mach 2 in seconds, white columns of fire punching through the thin air at high altitude. The heat blast from the launch was visible as a shimmering ripple against the blue sky. 15 miles inland, one of the HQ-9 radar vans erupted in a spectacular secondary explosion. The 1,000-pound warhead of the HARM missile had followed the radar beam straight into the emitter dish, detonating with enough force to flip the 10-ton vehicle onto its side. A geyser of black smoke and white sparks rose from the site, followed shortly by a second explosion as the nearby missile canisters cooked off. The Iranian air defense network for that sector went into a total blackout. The results of the electronic front were immediate and decisive. Without radar guidance, the Iranian coastal batteries were reduced to firing blindly into the sea, their expensive missiles falling harmlessly into the water miles from the Reagan. The digital dominance of the United States Navy had created a 100-mile bubble of safety around the carrier, allowing the damage control teams on the ship a few hours of precious stability to continue their repairs. The air around the growlers remained quiet, the only sound the steady, rhythmic breathing of the crew in their masks. But the unseen battle was raging across the entire spectrum. The smell of ozone in the cockpit was a reminder of the massive amounts of energy being harnessed to keep the enemy in the dark. The electronic front had won the morning, turning a high-tech threat into a useless collection of silent screens and burning radar vans. 9 in the morning. The mess decks of the USS Ronald Reagan. The space that usually served 3,000 meals a day had been transformed into a primary triage center, a makeshift hospital ward deep within the steel heart of the ship. The carrier was still maintaining its list of 5.2 degrees to starboard, forcing the medical teams to work on a slanted deck, while balancing trays of surgical instruments and bags of intravenous fluids. The environment was a stark, sterile contrast to the chaos of the hangar deck, yet it was filled with the heavy, iron scent of fresh blood and the sharp, chemical sting of hospital-grade antiseptic. The physical atmosphere was one of hushed, professional intensity. The hum of the ship's emergency ventilation system was the only constant sound, occasionally broken by the rhythmic beep of a heart rate monitor or the low, urgent murmurs of the Navy doctors and corpsmen. Despite the cooling systems, the air was warm and humid, carrying the faint, lingering smell of the smoke that had filled the ship hours earlier. Triage category red. Moving to the main surgical suite now. A senior medical officer shouted, gesturing toward a stretcher being carried by 4 soot-covered sailors. The human cost of the Iranian ballistic missile strike was now being tallied with grim precision. 12 sailors had been killed instantly when the 3,000-pound warhead punched through the berthing compartments adjacent to the auxiliary machinery room. They were the first casualties of the engagement, caught in their sleep or at their watch stations by the sheer kinetic force of the impact. Another 84 sailors had been wounded in action, their injuries ranging from severe flash burns and shrapnel wounds to the invisible, internal damage caused by the massive blast overpressure. The medical department was operating at its absolute limit. In the main sick bay, 3 surgical teams were working simultaneously, under the glow of high-intensity LED lamps. The surgeons, their blue scrubs stained with the reality of combat, were performing life-saving procedures to stabilize the most critically injured before they could be evacuated to shore-based facilities. Every movement was calculated. Every stitch was a battle against time and the steady, leaning pressure of the ship's list. At coordinates 23 degrees, 28 minutes north, longitude 61 degrees, 20 minutes east, the USS Ronald Reagan was no longer just a weapon of war. It was a sanctuary for the wounded. Outside, on the wind-swept flight deck, 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were being readied for a medical evacuation mission. The aircraft, their rotors blurring into a translucent gray disk against the bright morning sky, would carry the most critical patients to a specialized trauma center in Muscat, Oman, 300 miles to the west. The physical sensation of the medevac was a mix of vibration and salt spray. As the stretchers were loaded into the cramped cabins of the Seahawks, the corpsmen held the IV bags high, their faces set in masks of grim determination. The heat from the helicopter engines washed over the deck, smelling of burnt kerosene and sea air. With the collective roar of their twin T-7-100 engines, the helicopters lifted off, banking away from the smoky wake of the carrier and disappearing into the haze of the horizon. Inside the triage center, the work continued without pause. For the sailors who remained, the reality of the morning was sinking in. They moved through the slanted corridors with a new, quiet purpose, their eyes reflecting the exhaustion of a night spent fighting fire and water. There was no outward display of grief, only the professional resilience that defined the United States Navy. They had lost shipmates, and many more were fighting for their lives, but the ship was still under power and the mission was still active. The smell of coffee began to mix with the antiseptic, a small sign of returning routine in a world that had been turned upside down. The casualties of war were a heavy burden, but the Reagan was a ship built for this weight. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the black scar on the flight deck where the missile had entered, the crew prepared for the final phase of their journey. They were 1,000 miles from home, but they were together, and they were still afloat. 10 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. The USS Ronald Reagan was no longer the fast, predatory centerpiece of a carrier strike group. She was a 10-story fortress of steel moving at a restricted speed of 10 knots. The carrier was sitting 3 feet lower in the water than her design specifications allowed, a direct result of the thousands of tons of seawater held back by the wooden shoring and steel patches in the lower engineering compartments. The list had been trimmed to exactly 5 degrees to starboard, a precarious balance achieved by the deliberate flooding of the port side ballast tanks. The environment between the carrier and her escorts was one of high-tension proximity. To the port side, the fast combat support ship USNS Arctic had moved into a parallel station, separated by only 40 meters of churning, white-capped water. This was an underway replenishment, a maneuver that required nerves of steel even in calm weather. But with a listing, damaged carrier, it was a feat of extreme seamanship. The air between the two massive hulls was a pressurized tunnel of salt spray and the heavy, industrial scent of diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid. "Rope is across. Send the fuel lines." The deck officer on the Reagan shouted through his megaphone, his voice nearly lost in the roar of the sea. From the deck of the Arctic, high-tension lines were fired across the gap. Soon, 3 massive black rubber hoses were suspended between the ships, pulsing with the flow of thousands of gallons of JP5 aviation fuel and DFM marine diesel. The Reagan needed the fuel not just for her remaining aircraft, but to run the emergency generators that were powering the hundreds of portable Pone 100 pumps distributed throughout the flooded levels of the ship. Without this constant transfusion of energy, the internal battle against the ocean would be lost in hours. At coordinates 23 degrees 45 minutes north, longitude 60 degrees 58 minutes east, the tactical picture remained grim. The destroyer DDG 113, John Finn, and the cruiser CG-73 Port Royal maintained a tight box formation around the 2 larger ships. Their sonar arrays were pinging at maximum power, the rhythmic, metallic ping, ping, ping echoing through the water as they searched for the low-frequency signature of Iranian Kilo-class submarines. The physical sensation on the Reagan was one of heavy, sluggish momentum. The ship vibrated with a different frequency now. The usual smooth hum of the nuclear turbines had been replaced by a deeper, more labored thrumming as the propellers fought the massive drag of the flooded compartments. Every time the ship took a swell on the bow, the internal shoring in the auxiliary machinery room groaned, a sound like a giant tree snapping in a forest. The sailors in the repair lockers stood by with sledgehammers and wedges, ready to reinforce any timber that began to split under the pressure. The flight deck was a scene of organized salvage. Teams of sailors were using heavy-duty forklifts to move the wreckage of the 2 Super Hornets that had been crushed when the missile first struck. The twisted aluminum and scorched titanium were being pushed to the edge of the deck and secured with heavy chains. The smell of the flight deck was a nauseating mix of burnt rubber, chemical foam, and the iron scent of the sea. The black hole where the missile had entered was now covered by a 10-ton steel plate, welded into place by a team that had worked through the night in 40-knot winds. Bridge. TAO. We have 2 Iranian P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft loitering 40 miles to the northeast. The warfare commander reported, "They are staying outside the engagement envelope, but they are painting us with surface search radar." Captain Miller stood on the bridge wing, his face lined with the exhaustion of 30 hours without sleep. He watched the white wake of the Port Royal as it cut through the blue-green water. The Iranians were watching their wounded prey, waiting for a moment of weakness. or a failure of the internal patches. But the American screen was impenetrable. For every Iranian radar pulse that hit the strike group, the EA-18 Gulf Growlers overhead responded with a crushing weight of electronic interference. The long steam toward the port of Duqm in Oman would take another 48 hours. It was a race against structural fatigue and the relentless pressure of the ocean. The crew of the Reagan moved with a quiet, grim efficiency, their earlier adrenaline replaced by a deep, professional resolve. They were no longer fighting for a strategic objective. They were fighting for the survival of their home. The smell of the morning air was finally beginning to clear of the thickest smoke, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of the open sea. But as the sun beat down on the scarred flight deck, the heat served as a reminder of the fire that had almost consumed them. The giant was moving, slowly and painfully, but she was moving towards safety, protected by the most sophisticated shield of steel and silicon ever devised. 8 in the morning on the 15th of January, 2026. The approaches to the port of Duqm, Oman. The USS Ronald Reagan appeared on the horizon, not as a shimmering symbol of American power, but as a blackened, salt-stained titan of war. The carrier was still maintaining a list of 4.8 degrees to starboard, a permanent lean that gave the massive ship the appearance of a wounded animal limping toward a sanctuary. At coordinates 19 degrees 39 minutes north, longitude 57 degrees 42 minutes east, the deep blue of the Arabian Sea met the pale, sandy coastline of Oman. The environment in the harbor was a hive of industrial and military activity. 6 heavy-duty harbor tugs, their engines churning the turquoise water into frothing white circles, moved into position against the carrier's hull. The air was thick with the smell of industrial diesel exhaust, hot asphalt from the nearby piers, and the dry, dusty heat of the Omani desert. The sound was a symphony of mechanical labor. The high-pitched whine of tugboat winches, the deep rumble of the Reagan's own remaining auxiliary engines, and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a pair of MH-60 Sierra helicopters hovering overhead to provide final security. As the carrier cleared the breakwater, the full extent of the damage was visible to the crowds of port workers and military personnel gathered on the pier. The flight deck, once a pristine expanse of gray non-skid, was scarred by a massive, scorched crater aft of the island. A 10-ton steel plate had been welded over the entry point, surrounded by a halo of white chemical fire-retardant foam that had dried in the sun. Along the starboard side, just above the waterline, the hull was buckled and scorched, with streaks of rust and black soot marking the spots where the internal fires had raged for 12 hours. The physical sensation on the bridge was one of profound, heavy relief. Captain Miller stood at the center window, his hands gripped tightly behind his back. The vibration of the ship had changed. The labored thrumming of the sea-damaged propellers finally went silent as the tugs took over the work of maneuvering the 97,000-ton vessel. Had shifted from the acrid scent of smoke to the smell of the harbor stagnant water, hot metal, and the promise of land. The navigator called out, his voice cracking with fatigue. The tactical after-action report, compiled by the staff of Carrier Strike Group 5, told a story of professional excellence under catastrophic pressure. Over the course of the 72-hour engagement, the strike group had neutralized 68 Iranian drones, 14 cruise missiles, and 8 ballistic missiles. The cruiser CG-67 Shiloh and the destroyer DDG-113 John Finn had expended 65% of their total missile magazines to maintain the Aegis wall. Iranian losses were calculated with clinical precision. 2 mobile ballistic missile launch sites destroyed, 1 primary underground command and control bunker obliterated, and 12 fast attack craft neutralized. The Iranian coastal radar network between Jask and Chabahar had been effectively decapitated by the electronic warfare operations of the EA-18 Gulf Growlers. The United States had achieved its strategic objective, the neutralization of the immediate threat to freedom of navigation in the Northern Arabian Sea, but the price had been etched into the steel of the Reagan. The human cost was finalized. As the ship touched the pier, 12 United States Navy sailors had been killed in action. 84 had been wounded, with 15 still in critical condition, at the Naval Hospital in Muscat. As the heavy mooring lines were secured and the brow was lowered, the crew of the Reagan stood at the rails, in their soiled work uniforms. They did not cheer. They stood in a silent, exhausted line, watching as the first ambulances moved toward the ship to receive the remaining casualties. The physical presence of the carrier at the pier was a testament to the thousands of individual acts of courage that had occurred in the dark, flooded compartments and on the fire-swept hangar deck. The heroics were not found in a single moment, but in the 48 hours of continuous, disciplined labor that kept the ship afloat. The wood shoring in the auxiliary machinery room was still holding, the timbers grumbers groaning one last time as the ship settled against the fenders of the pier. The sun climbed higher, baking the scorched flight deck and the American flag flying at half-mast from the island. The USS Ronald Reagan was no longer in the fight, but she had survived. The giant was home, her hull battered, and her crew changed, but her heart was still beating. The mission was accomplished, and the long, difficult process of repair and remembrance was only just beginning.